Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have David Richards.
Hello.
Andrew Mason.
Good morning.
Nate Hopkins.
Hi there.
Dave Kimura.
Hey there.
And Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. This week, we're talking about something tools mess up your life. Right, Dave?
Don't get me started, man.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io. No, we want to get you started. That's the whole point.
So my initial thought and premises around this is that when you have processes and tools that actually hurt your productivity, they are not bringing in rewards. So it's not making the application more secure. It's not making it more stable. You're not increasing your productivity. Then should these processes or tools be taken outside of your SDLC or software development lifecycle?
You know what the answer is, right, Dave? Move to JavaScript.
No.
Oh, great. I'm done.
No, it's true. Do you have an example? Because, I mean, most of the tools that I pull in, there's some kind of payoff, right? Usually it's some form of automation or infrastructure or something. The infrastructure tools are the ones that kind of come to mind that, oh, I don't need this anymore, but I'm still maintaining it. But a lot of the rest of them are productivity tools that save me time. And so, yeah, sometimes they hurt, but most of the time they don't. Or the benefit outweighs the cost.
I think a lot of times, and where I think a lot of developers can more pinpoint this is in the processes or red tape, if you will. And I think that it's important to have processes. You know, otherwise people are going to be running amok. They're going to be conflicting with each other, and it's just going to be a nightmare. But from the coding perspective, that's where things get a little bit more iffy. So let's say if you are a editor, you prefer an editor that is old, antiquated, doesn't have really a lot of functionality. It's just a simple text editor. Well, how much are you hurting your productivity by not having something that where you can find definition on a particular method that you're calling or something like that? You know, are you hurting yourself by not switching over to something a little more elegant or a little more feature rich?
I was resisting the urge to say Vim there, but I'm not going to.
I know I was too.
You can pick on Vim. Just leave my Emacs alone and we'll be friends.
I'm going to pick on both at the same time.
That's called SpaceMax, and that's what I use, and knock it off. That's Emacs and Vim inside of Emacs.
Yeah. One thing that I'll just throw in here is that for a long time, so my primary editor these days actually is Visual Studio Code, but I used Emacs for a long time. I used Vim before that, and there were definitely terrific tools in there. The problem wasn't that it didn't have the functionality. The problem was that I spent a lot of time building my own lightsaber instead of just going into the plugins tab on Visual Studio Code and saying, I want that, and then having it more or less set itself up. And that's the trade-off I think that I'd be making there, right? There were some nice things about Emacs and some things that once you got running were pretty automatic. But yeah, you usually had to do some form of setup on your own.
Yeah,
part of the challenge is muscle memory, right? Once you've got the muscle memory for one of those tools, it can be very disruptive to pause and adopt a new one. It's the same for like adopting Vim or Emacs in the first place. It takes time. Yeah. It's like learning to play the piano, right? It takes a while and a lot of practice to become efficient. And once you become efficient, it's very difficult to leave that ecosystem.
Yeah, but a lot of these systems have plugins for key bindings for Vim or Emacs. So in my case, on VS Code, I use a really wacky hybrid of the built-in keyboard shortcuts that come with VS Code and the ones that are set up for me by the Emacs plugin.
Has it gotten good enough to be sufficient, I guess? Like every time I've done that and tried, there's always some like little nagging part of it that doesn't work very well.
Yeah, it's never been 100% the same, but typically on those things, I found another way of doing it. And then, I had to retrain a little bit of muscle memory. But for most of the more common things, just the generic text editing commands and things like that have, convenient key bindings. I mean, those imported directly, so they were fine. So it was usually the more generic parts of my process, like, okay, go kick off the tests, go kick off this. But the other thing is that even then, I can just put the command for the command line into the shortcuts tab on VS Code, and I could set it up for the same thing I had in Emacs. And so the workaround there was the plugin's already there, the command's already set up, and all I had to do was set up the key binding.
Yeah. And, I think that kind of is a overall good point. If you were to lose your computer today, let's say if you had the important things backed up, and if you were to get a new computer, how long would it take you to get that computer set up to become productive again? The original steps that you had, do you have them documented in an easy way to follow to where you can replicate and then get productive by that afternoon? And I think in a lot of cases, the answer is no, either because we are on a newer version of Mac OS, and the last time that we stood up our development environment was years ago. So there's one tool that I'm sure most people are familiar with is Homebrew. But what I think a lot of people don't know is that you can do a command brew space bundle space dump, and it'll compile a list of all your taps, your installed brew files, and then the casks as well. And then you can just call brew bundle on this brew file that was generated, and then it's going to just reinstall all of those things for you. So then you don't even have to think about, okay, what tools do I need on my computer? Because chances are there's a cask for it where you can just have it in your list, and then when you go to provision your new environment, it's going to be much, much quicker.
Yeah, one other thing that I did with the Emacs setup, I mean, there are workarounds for all this stuff, and people have solved a lot of these problems, but I had basically a .files repo, and I haven't maintained it much since I moved over because it was mostly for my Emacs stuff and maybe a couple of other tools. But essentially, I would back up my Emacs config. So getting set up again wasn't that big a deal.
By the way, I love that, Dave. I just did that with the brew. Now I've got a brew file. I had no idea I could do that. But yeah, I've followed other people's .files that they've shared on their GitHub profiles. Just for getting their laptop started, and that's sometimes helped. But yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I try to get tools that are reusable. I try to make sure every project is self-contained so that I can rebuild it. I always build a make file in every project that does a lot of my work. So it's in the Git repo of how I install things, handle dependencies, where my documentation is, where the actual code is stored. So that way it's easy just to come into an environment and make sure it's running the way I need it to.
Yeah, but isn't the ultimate version of that in the cloud then? I mean, you're talking about just having it set up, right? Then if my laptop disappears, then I just, I got to sign into the cloud from something else. Or am I missing the boat on something?
I do a lot in cloud. So I get it all set up that way, Git repo. I use, Paperspace? I use for a lot of my data work, which is just, I have it all pre-configured, an environment with lots of GPUs that I can go and train models on. So all that stuff is out in the cloud where I can lose my laptop and still go to work.
If you stick as close to the Rails core as possible when developing a web application, so that means, forget all your fancy JavaScript frameworks and just stick to Action View, maybe add in Stimulus, just sticking to the Rails core, you're going to be able to more easily maintain that project long term. Much like with your own development environment, if you stick to the very basics of things, so you have your brew file, which installs all the little gadgets and gizmos that you like having on your computer. But if you don't do too much configuration changes on each one of those things, or if you have things backed up to a dot file that's going to easily configure them, then you're going to greatly reduce the amount of time it takes to not only stand up your environment, but also to get it back to the way you like it. But then also to make it repeatable. So if you are someone who destroys the computer once a year, then you're not going to have any loss of productivity.
Yeah, as someone who destroys their computer almost every time I update, which is a habit that I would very much like to get rid of. I've made it almost into a science of I back up a lot. I have all my dot files in a repo. I back up all my homebrew bundles. I have basically created a way, if I accidentally destroyed my VS Code settings, I can pull all those down. I have a command that will reinstall all the plugins. And also, I think there's ways to, I've been looking into this a little bit recently, but there's cloud IDEs now that are becoming more and more popular, like Coder. And I think Microsoft's going to launch something specifically for VS Code. That and Docker is also a way that I can get back up and running very, very fast. Even if I need to jump on to another computer, if I'm using a cloud service like Coder, I can open my VS Code settings right there and have an IDE ready to work.
One thought that came to my mind as you guys have been talking about your editor setups and whatnot, like I've got my dot files out on GitHub with a README that instructs myself how to get a system set back up, and usually within 10 minutes, I can come in with a new system or a new operating system and be developing again within 10 or 15 minutes. So that's pretty fantastic. But there was a rite of passage to get to that point, and tools like Visual Studio Code, I think, make this much more approachable for the beginner, right? And I mean, that seems like a worthy goal. I mean, as you kind of grow and mature in your career, of course, you're going to get more sophisticated about how your setup and operating system, or just your entire environment is working. But initially, you want to take all those barriers to entry away. I mean, if you listen to some of the code boot camp, folks talk about just that first night of, we're here at a meetup or a hackathon or something. We're trying to intro new people to development. I mean, a lot of times your first night is just trying to set up an environment.
Yeah, that's true. One thing that I'll throw in there too is that my kids went to a coding boot camp at NGConf a couple weeks ago, mainly because my wife was at a BYU Women's Conference, and I had to put them somewhere, so I signed them up. And they were using Code Sandbox, .io, which we can throw into the show notes. And I was talking to the guys at StackBlitz, which a bunch of the other coding schools use. And in both of those cases, those are in-browser systems. And so you can actually get people starting to code. I don't know if there's a good Ruby option for any of those, but at least in JavaScript, a lot of that stuff's actually moving to the browser in the first place. And so that's all cloud-based as well. So the setup is nil.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that is really good. A lot of people have been using Jupyter for this reason as well. I think there's about 40 kernels for it, so 40 different languages that you can use. But the same idea that you could work on a piece of code, have it all basically self-contained and shareable. It doesn't quite handle the dependencies unless you do a couple steps, but it's not too bad. But it's just this idea that I'm working in my browser, I'm building things in a shareable way, and I can use comments, in line. I do markdown comments, and I can have my graphs and my text and my code all mixed in there. And then with a couple lines of code, I can export that into a library pretty easily. But just that idea that it's reusable, it's exposed, it's literate, the way Nuth used to talk about literate programming. That's the effort to try to get past that barrier of the unknowns, all those things that our tools are doing for us, trying to make those things go away and just say, I understand what it's doing, or it's reusable enough.
The thing that's interesting about Jupyter too, I've talked to a number of people who are using it for various things, is that with some of the ones that I mentioned before, the Code Sandbox and StackBlitz, those you can basically have set up for a particular framework. But most of the Jupyter notebooks that I see are focused around things like IoT or machine learning or And so the use case driven development is really interesting there too.
Yeah, I like that, because then you can get right into something you're trying to do and not worry about it. What I've seen a lot of people do is they'll put a Docker container behind the Jupyter Notebook. So now all the dependencies are in a container, and then the notebook is connecting to that, and then it's really portable, because whatever the use case is, it's ready to go, and then you can work with it and understand it.
Yeah,
that kind of dovetails into like the what we led off with in terms of the tooling, right? So is all of it necessary? How deep do we go? That sort of thing. I mean, because Docker, like if you're going to open that can of worms, you can spend quite a bit of time just trying to figure out what it is you need to be doing with that entire ecosystem, right? I mean, it's fantastic once you've learned that, but is that a necessary tool, or is it something that we should try to simplify?
Well, and I've seen people kind of, I wanted to say pave over the can of worms, but that's an interesting mental image that doesn't really help, where essentially they use Docker to get people running without necessarily exposing all the underlying stuff, right? It's like run these 2 commands and then you're up and off to the races. And you don't really think about that you're running Docker under the hood. And I think a lot of these tools can go both ways, right? It's like, oh, okay, I'm going to use React, and then you go down the rabbit hole, and then you go down the other rabbit hole in the rabbit hole, versus, if you get enough of this stuff, maybe create React app and a couple of things in there, and you just kind of do it the way that it leads you along, it can be reasonably simple, and you can go down the rabbit hole later.
Yeah. Well, I have some opinions about Docker, and I think Docker is great. It definitely, that combined with Kubernetes, solved a real world problem. You have applications that are very microservices driven and done properly. So there's no communication between applications. They're very isolated. Each microservice does one thing or one small sets of things, and it does it very well. And then if you need to develop on that, then you do all your local development on your computer, but then you need to ship it out to production. And I think that's where a lot of the problems with microservices would come into play, where you're shipping out wrong versions of different microservices that will conflict or not interact well with others. So Docker comes in, and then you can build all of your microservices images and then deploy those images, knowing that now everything is on the correct tag, everything is getting deployed on this date, and it's going to work. And Kubernetes takes that a step further with managing all of the backend infrastructure for your containers and everything, or your pods. But I think that people have taken this great thing, which solved a real world problem, and introduced it in areas where it does not belong. And by doing that, meaning that you're bringing it into your development environment to now develop off of, now you are introducing a complexity or a tool set that doesn't need to be there. And now you're just adding complexities that's going to slow down your development.
Yeah, I've seen that recently. Last week we had somebody spinning up a Docker container, and it took him a few days because of the complexity. We went from, hey, this is how we want to containerize our apps, to here's all the other things we want to throw in there. And it goes far, and there's maybe good reasons for them, but the complexity, we leave that complexity on the surface where somebody has to figure it out every time. And so the amount of mind share it takes to be able to get started is growing too much. And then we also expose a lot of what's going on inside to people on the outside that are trying to set it up or use it. And so it's getting a little bit hard, I think, from a lack of discipline. It's getting hard to reuse these tools the way we want to sometimes, or we have to have a specialist on the team that can kind of vouch for we're doing this right. So it's kind of gone a long ways from, hey, here's a recipe, do this, and now you can run it, to, oh my goodness, we've got a lot of things we're trying to do. In software, we're getting pretty good at architecting systems where we write bigger modules, or we drive the complexity down off the interface. But I don't know that we've done it very well with Kubernetes and Docker right now. it seems hard sometimes to be able to just pick up those tools and use them the way they were supposed to.
Yeah, I think when you're getting started in an environment, the real benefit there is the abstraction that it provides, right? Look at what I don't have to even consider or think about. Like, I just start the Docker container, and that abstraction is working really well for me. It's as that begins to become more leaky, right? And the internals start to get exposed, then it starts to fall down a bit.
Yeah. One other thing that I've seen is that in some cases, people move to Docker because, we moved over to this cloud, and this cloud does the automatic Docker, scaling and all of the other things, load balancing, so they kind of have the Kubernetes recipe all figured out for me. I don't have to worry about that stuff. And then the complexity gets passed down to somebody else, right? And so it simplifies up here and it adds complexity down here. And a lot of times there's just not that free communication between the two, or a way to really figure out how to make it work for both ends.
Yeah, I agree. One thing I will say is this past week I was at RailsConf, and I was in Noel Rappin's workshop on Stimulus, and he had said multiple times, and I just missed the tweets, that you should probably set up the project beforehand, but I didn't do that because I didn't see that. And when I got into the project or into the workshop, I tried to set up the app, and it, of course, didn't work. I think it was Nokogiri. Something wouldn't install Nokogiri. And then I saw and realized he had a Docker compose and a Docker file, and I quickly spun up that Docker instance, and I was off to the races. So for things like that, I think there is a lot of complexity that I think we just haven't really solved yet with Docker. I think once we kind of establish some patterns and we all kind of mature in that space a little bit, it's going to get a lot easier, and we're going to have these more streamlined flows. So you can just run one command and get up and running and not have to spend, days or hours like getting all that set up.
Yeah, I think that once, I think we solved the problem fairly well with these kinds of tools for running code, once it's ready. And if we can mature better with these types of tools around setting them up as well, more mind share or handle the abstractions a little bit better. And probably the problem with that is it's not the tools themselves, but it's the teams, the way that they implemented them. Like, okay, we solved this, we got busy. Oh, we didn't come back and revisit that. And now there's a lot you have to know to be able to use these tools, or else everything breaks.
And, I think that just because this tool set that you're using works great on production, it greatly increased the stability of your application in production, does not mean that you then need to take that tool set over into your development environment. And likewise, in your development environment, you don't necessarily want to take some of the tool sets that you use in there to simplify your development life and take it into production.
Well, and I think your other point earlier, Dave, about, having a process for a lot of this stuff plays in here too, right? Because, you don't have to use the same tools across systems, but if you also have a process, here's how you set up the app, here's how you get it running, here's how we like to commit code, here's how we like to structure things so that it runs through CI, and then here's how the CI system actually builds the Docker container if you're going to use it up there, but not down here, right? And so if you have all these processes documented and well understood, then instead of having the conversation about why the heck doesn't this work, the question is, what's wrong with this process, and what are we missing here? And so then you're having a conversation about how to communicate about this stuff, rather than having somebody sit there and bang their head against the wall trying to chip away at some problem that somebody else could have solved for them.
Yeah, and one nice thing about Docker is that it does take your environment out of the equation, assuming that you have Docker properly up and running, because it is containerized. Your environment really has little to nothing to do with the actual running Docker instance. So I do see the positives in some areas, but I think with that positive, you also get the drawback of you're losing some visibility, you're losing some ease of development or ease of use if you don't, let's say have the Ruby interpreter installed on your computer, but instead it all lives in a Docker container, because then you have to worry about mounting volumes and that kind of stuff, making sure that you're not losing work or that sync is working right, whatever the case may be.
I'm just going to go be a pig farmer now.
Well, it makes me really appreciate when people have gone before, or when I've taken the time to just obsess about the few things that matter from a perspective. Like if I'm obsessing about making an application stable, I can use these tools to great effect. And if I'm obsessing over how to write the code really well, I can do that to great effect. But there's some of these processes and tools where nobody's really obsessed about all the pieces. Like, okay, we've got a whole use case here where somebody's coming in and they're trying to do, set something up. Well, nobody's obsessed on how to really make that well. And so you go, like Dave was saying, into this danger world of things I don't understand, or things I could get wrong and could have really bad side effects. But yeah, I really appreciate it when somebody's focused and then they obsess on how to make something not as good as they can make it.
And, I think Rails in many cases, not all, but in many cases is that answer where, look back to DHH's original video, like, look at all these things I'm not doing. It's like, let's focus on development. Let's just focus on our goal, because we're not getting paid to write code. We're getting paid to ship an application. So let's focus on that. And introducing all these other tool sets can have some benefits, but if it's hurting your ultimate goal of shipping that application to make money, to then you can get paid, the company can grow, you can get more resources, then you're focusing on, or you're introducing the wrong things. Absolutely. Or at least if that's what the business is calling for right now due to some crap that you inherited, or whatever the situation may be that you've kind of been brought into, then at least have a roadmap to navigate away from that. Put in some effort and time to get your environment to where it can be highly productive, so you can focus on shipping that application.
Absolutely. I always miss that. I work in a lot of different environments, and everything outside of Rails seems to have stopped at the 90%. And they just leave it up to everybody to build in that productivity layers on our own. It's like, no, we really either need to take the time to do that for everybody or for ourselves, but getting it to that point where, okay, this system will work very clearly and I'm productive now. That's critical. But yeah, I really appreciate the way Rails figured that out. That was the most important thing to do.
And I think appropriately, over time, as things evolved, so did the core Rails. They saw the need to introduce better JavaScript package handling so that those who decide to deviate from the standard could introduce JavaScript sprinkles, like, just add in a React library and component, or Vue.js, something like that, to accomplish some of the things that Rails just inherently doesn't do very well. But I think overall, they are adopting and moving with the times in, a respectively quick manner too. I think they're keeping up very well.
I think it's kind of the batteries included, like standard library type thinking, right? Put everything in there that you might need, and when you need it, it's just there waiting for you. One of the interesting things to tie this back to the Docker conversation, about 4 or 5 years ago, I really jumped onto the Docker bandwagon pretty early. And one of the things that I did where I was working at the time, I had a need to set up a server that was running Graphite, StatsD, Grafana, some of those types of tools. And if you've ever tried to install that manually, it is painful. And so I built a Docker container that violated essentially all the best practices of what Docker is supposed to be. And I went for abstraction. I'm just going to hide all the complexity of that, all of the services and pieces necessary to run a Graphite and StatsD instance inside of a single Docker container. And it actually ended up being wildly popular because of that. It's had over 8 million downloads now, and has served as the foundation for a lot of other people taking it and running further with it. I haven't really maintained it actively in quite some time, but I think Rails kind of does the same thing, right? And that dovetails into this monolith versus microservice debate as well in terms of building your application. Because where Docker gets pretty complicated for people is when you go take this microservice mentality, and now you have to have an orchestration piece, right? How do I coordinate all the services that are running? And you didn't really get rid of the complexity, you just moved it somewhere else.
Yeah, which is interesting too, because in a monolith, I can get lazy and not quite understand how the whole system's working. But whenever I have a system, process or a tool like Docker, now I've really got to cross that gap and understand the big picture. And I think that's always where I get slow, is when I hit a tool that I realize I don't know what I'm doing. And so now I'm out of sync with the tool, and I've either got to build it right and, figure out how to abstract it correctly, or just understand the pieces I'm missing, which, let's face it, there's a lot of those gaps we all have. We try to pick them up when we have to, but only when we have to.
It's definitely true when you kind of, for me, every time I deviate from kind of the Rails golden path of accomplishing something, like it just introduces pain into everything that's happening. And then you find yourself fighting the framework, and yeah, it's difficult if that's the road you choose.
I had an experience this morning, actually. I just finished a review for a friend. A friend wants to buy a company, and the company's really just all around a Rails app. And so he asked me to review the code. Just what's he getting into? And they didn't deviate from the Rails way. They were very clean on dependencies. Everything was done the way you'd expect. So I was able to tell him, I looked pretty hard at the code, and yeah, that's very maintainable. You're not inheriting a time bomb here. It's been done well. It's understandable. You can grow it. You can scale it. You can hire somebody to work on it. So it was really amazing. So this what we're talking about today really affected somebody's bottom line today too, which is pretty exciting to see.
Having said that, there is a class of applications that do require deviating and choosing to split your front end or things like that. And there may be other reasons. Maybe the app doesn't dictate that, but the company itself is on this high growth trajectory, right? And you're trying to plan and get ready for scaling the team. Initially, for me personally, it really is difficult to embrace that, because I prefer small teams and being very productive with small groups. And I think Rails is well suited to that. But if your goal is, I'm going to grow my dev team by 50 people this year, then you have to adopt some different strategies. And that's when SPA starts to look appealing, because you can grow that team independently. That's when microservices start to look more appealing. But it's all tied to this principle of Conway's law, right? Like our technology patterns that we implement essentially reflect the communication patterns within the organization. So if you understand where the organization is going in that direction, it may not necessarily align with the Rails way.
And while I agree with that, and I can definitely understand where people reach that conclusion, I think that often they reach for that conclusion without thinking about the added cost that it comes with. And that's complicating your development process. Everyone could eventually justify the need for an SPA, but reaching for an SPA, the first thing, like they do a Rails new and then Webpack equals React or something like that, the very first thing that they do, then they're adding in so much complexity without really having the justification yet. And I think that's where my main issue is. You're always going to have the one-off situations where someone says, our application has to be an SPA. I think like Photoshop Online, that would be an application where I would not want that to be refreshing the page for every vector or line I drew. Something like that totally makes sense.
Photoshop Online is a scary thought.
This episode is brought to you by Triplebyte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, you spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, Triplebyte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, And if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. Triplebyte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/rogues. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through Triplebyte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
I did that literally once. So I'm guilty of that, where years ago I built a Rails app, immediately it was either React or Angular on it. I spent a week or two building that out and realized I'd gone way too early on that. So I threw it away and started over, and kept it simple. And that was enough. But it was interesting how I thought, oh no, it's justifiable. I definitely want all these other things. And then I realized how expensive those things are. And I thought, you know what? Let's force them to make me do it. make me. I could build you an SPA, but make me. Anyway, but yeah, I'd made that mistake and lost a couple of weeks of development time because I had
and it's so funny because the conventional wisdom on the web seems to go that way. I mean, I have shows on JavaScript, React, Angular, and Vue, and they all kind of push it that way. Hey, just let the framework take over the whole page. And then I'm building a podcasting app, and it turns out that having the page refresh every time you click a link, it works pretty darn good for most things. There are a handful of things where I'm like, no, this needs to respond in this way. But yeah, so and it's easy to fall into, right? Because people you respect are going to give you the opinion that you need the tool when you may not.
Well, that kind of ties into like our topic for today. Are these complex tools really necessary? And in some of this, SPA world, the complexity of the tooling and the libraries and the stacks that you choose do require a full-time, you have to be thinking about that aspect of it full-time, right? You can't be split in this full stack way where you're concerned about your database schema and things like that. You really do need to specialize if you choose some of these highly sophisticated tools. And of course, somebody who specializes in that is going to advocate that that's the way to go because that's where their knowledge is centered.
Does that make them wrong?
For certain use cases or a lot of use cases, kind of like what you just alluded to with your podcasting app, I think it does.
Yeah, I get it that a lot of people want the new and the latest thing, but does it really add value? And I think it takes a little bit of discipline to say, no, I don't see the value yet. Or I'm willing to be wrong in this case, but let's go simple and see if that's good enough. I was looking at just what's out there these days. And there's so many of these specialized SPA type jobs. And I'm not sure, but I'd imagine a lot of those wouldn't have been necessary. We just kind of accepted that we have to build it these ways. But that's a lot of people working on projects, doing a lot of work that, I don't know.
But again, if you bring that back to the communication patterns and the growth trajectory of the organization, it may be necessary to do that to scale your team. But I do agree with Dave. That really rubs me the wrong way because I want to be as efficient as possible with as few as possible. But and I think that line in the sand where you actually hit the tipping point and it starts to pay off is probably much further out than people think it is.
Yeah. Well, I've been rereading Getting Real, and that thing's been around forever, that book. And but I was looking at that last weekend, just getting simple things out there and then working with customers, that's really the most important thing. And then after that, sure. But how hard is it really to go from a basic Rails view into an SPA versus needing to get it up front? I mean, it's not that hard to add later if you need it.
So let me pull this back the other direction then, because I'm curious, and I'm a little conflicted on this point. So you also have these cloud systems like Firebase or Microsoft Azure or AWS, that have varying levels of learning curve to them, I'll admit. But Firebase seems pretty easy to get set up with, and it'll handle a lot of your back-end systems. It'll handle a lot of your, a lot of this stuff, and basically give you data forms and the whole 9 yards. And so then you just pull in a couple of queries And, if you have to do data visualization, you pull in a data visualization library and then you're off to the races. So if we're talking about tools that you don't need because they add complexity to your app, then is there a line out there where you ought to be looking at a system like this? It's kind of a back end as a service and not even worry about Rails.
Yeah. So where I kind of draw the line on these back end systems, and I do think they do provide some flexibility and some really nice things. But in a lot of cases, when you commit to one of them, then you're locking yourself into a provider. And that's where I have my issue, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when does your company get acquired by someone else? They have a different direction. And now you have to have this migration effort of moving stuff from one provider to another, from AWS to Azure. And if you are deviating from a more core system, so if you're not using Postgres, instead, if you're using whatever AWS's database engine is, not the Aurora, but like a Redshift or something, then what kind of headaches are you then going to introduce down the road? So that's where I kind of draw the line and kind of put my foot down with the infrastructure side of things is if I take all of this stuff, other than the deployment scripts that I'm using for AWS, am I going to be able to easily replicate that over into Azure to where now the infrastructure doesn't matter? It's all about the deployment scripts that you would have to modify, not your infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on that a little bit because most of the companies that I've spoken with that have acquired other companies, they generally will let them run on whatever they're running on until they have a compelling reason to move. And so, yes, you are setting yourself up for that potential vendor lock-in, but the flip side of it is that it may never become an issue. It could be, but it may not become an issue.
Yeah. And I'm just coming from having been through 2 acquisitions and having have this happen each time. So, just from personal experience and burns, I learned after the first time to make my application more infrastructure or provider agnostic.
Yeah, that's fair. But I do wonder, maybe you don't ever intend to sell, or, maybe you're only going to sell to companies that aren't going to force you to change your infrastructure. Are there other reasons not to use some of these tools that abstract away a lot of the stuff that we worry about in our own setup and tooling?
So I think if you are going to introduce something like that, then you should have a wrapper around it to where the entry point to that service is isolated to where you only have to change one small area of your application to then accommodate something else. But don't let that infrastructure dictate the core business logic of your code. Wrap it into something else that you're then calling out, but then within your business logic, you would just have the calls to this wrapper, then makes an execution call out to whatever service.
I think the introduction of GraphQL makes it a little bit easier to have that interface that Dave's talking about. That if I were to start with a backend as a service, having a GraphQL front end or interface makes it a lot easier to replace the backend if I decide I outscaled it or it was wrong or whatever I needed to do. But that's a big commitment to say I want to now go build a whole backend because, but yeah, I think you've got to have a really clear interface to be able to even consider it.
Yeah, but if you do have a wrapper interface over the top of, say, Firebase or something, then yeah, you could go in and replace the Firebase calls with API calls to another system.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that does allow you to kind of reflect and migrate and, and either write to both for a while or, whatever you have to do.
Although that wrapper layer does add some additional complexity, right? And the benefit I think you led with on some of those types of services, Chuck, where it essentially lowers the barrier, right, for developers to get in and actually build an app. Going back to what David had said, the goal here is to get an application in front of somebody, right? That's or Dave. That's our goal is to put an app. We're shipping an application, not necessarily getting paid to write code. And if commoditizing some of those back-end components makes it easier, lowers the barrier to entry, then more power to them.
Yep, I tend to agree. I mean, if you're looking to make it migratable, you can. But yeah, I also agree that it does add complexity because now you have a layer that you have to maintain on top of it.
And it's always going to be about trade-offs. At the point in time where you are at in the development life cycle, how much time can you invest in creating this wrapper without delaying the end product? Because, ultimately, as we all have alluded to, the end product is going to be the ultimate goal. But if you know that your company is very wishy-washy and has changed environments many times over the past few years, because whatever newest and coolest is out now, then it may be more worth it to build in that wrapper layer. So it's not Friday night at midnight, you're calling all hands on shift to then build in this new integration to this other tool that they introduced that dictated you now have to use this other service. So you're going to have to weigh it based on a case-by-case basis to see what's going to be ultimately best for the customer, what's going to be best for the application, what's going to be best for our daily lives that we're going to have to deal with.
I think organizational stability is a really fascinating thing because I've inherited systems that have done exactly what Dave's talking about, where they built the right perfect system for what the organization wanted, and then the organization shifted, and it was a complete mismatch later. And brilliant people had built brilliant systems, but things had changed. And just getting a sense of, if people don't have a clear goal or have a sense of how are we going to serve our customers, it tends to get hard to make any kind of a decision that's not just your basic, really simple, the same thing everybody does everything. But and sometimes that's just the environment you're in. It's not the business's fault. It's just not that stable. This is what it's going to take to work in this space. But yeah, I've underestimated that sometimes. Where we build this great system, or I've inherited a system that's built great, and then everything changed.
Yeah. And I'm in the same boat there. The only reason why I am passionate about it is because I've made that mistake multiple times. And now I'm like, I don't want to deal with this again. I don't want to do this again. So I try to, gear things differently when I start a new application.
I'm cringing because I just made that mistake. And now I'm realizing I've just earlier today realized that I'm going to have to walk backwards, and I'm so unhappy.
Well, I think we all have to kind of walk into that thorn bush a couple of times and then kind of go, oh, that hurts when I go that way. I'm not going that way this time.
Oh, Chuck, I didn't walk into it. I plunged head first.
Well, then you're going to get some scrapes. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
One other thing that I'm curious about here with, talking about tools, maybe hindering the process is, and this came out of, David talking about some of the ideas around, we built the perfect tool and then things shifted. And so what I'm wondering is, do we get to the point then where, we've been using the right tool all along and then something changes, and so now we're up against one of the constraints that Rails puts on us, or we're up against one of the constraints that maybe a front-end library puts on us, or we're up against the constraints that our server can really run, or we have some kind of concurrency level that Ruby doesn't handle well, or something like that. Do we get to the point where those tools are the tools that we're actually fighting against instead of the sort of infrastructure tools or the coding tools?
I see that. The allegory of the boiling frog, where the warm water gets slowly warmer and all of a sudden it's unbearable. That's kind of what that is, right? Where things slowly, we hit constraints slowly. We're used to working a little bit harder, then a little bit harder, and we're able to kind of do that. But nobody really can poke their head out and say, man, if we had built this differently, or if we had a system organized differently, this would be a whole lot easier. But it's hard because we get there by degrees, and then we just learn to inherit it. Or we get there by degrees, and then we build a fairly sophisticated system that fixing it isn't trivial anymore. So yeah, it happens. I don't know the answer, what to do.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just inherent. Like, I'm right there with you guys in terms of having done things wrong a lot of times. And so now my default is to reach for, Rails out of the box, I go with Postgres and Redis. Like there's certain components that I know are tried and true, and they can scale massively. And I just reach for them every time because I know they can be effective. But I mean, it may come to a point where it doesn't serve me well or serve the need well for what I'm after. But I wonder if that's just an inherent problem in what it is we do, because it's so complicated and we're sitting on top of, a company with changing requirements, that you come in tomorrow and everything can be different.
Yeah. And usually where I've seen this, people run into this are, with Ruby in particular, it's, oh, well, I have a certain need for a certain level of concurrency that I didn't realize I had before. And that usually comes with some form of scaling and a few other concerns, right? And so then they're looking at things like Elixir as an answer to that. And, so sometimes they build in a separate system, and it's almost like a microservice architecture just for that one thing that needs that particular performance. And, sometimes that's not really even a good answer. But then I've also run into people with the front end frameworks, for example. They all do things just a little bit differently. And so what they run into is they run up against some constraint with the way that React kind of pushes you to do things, and realize that maybe an Ember or Angular doesn't have that particular quirk to it. And so, but then they get into the other system and they find out that it has some other quirk that also gets in their way. So it's a hard problem to solve, but it's always interesting to see, at what basic level are you running into these things, and when is, hey, I love this tool, I love this thing, I love Ruby, I love Rails, but it's not going to solve the problem the way I need it solved.
Well, 20 years ago, I loved Visual Basic, and I was developing applications in Visual Basic, and it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Not as much as I enjoyed Rails, but at the time, it was really great. But then, if I had kept that same mindset and never shifted on to something new when the demand required, so when the shift of the Web 2.0, you had a lot more interactions with websites came along. If I still stuck to Visual Basic or maybe upgraded to .NET VB and did web forms, then I would have kind of been left in the dust, because now I'm managing a back-end application to do certain functionality and then just kind of wrapped around a HTML front end to that. So there's always going to be a shift. And I think Rails is still young, that we can at least squeeze another 15 years out of it before the next big thing comes along that's going to require a different way of doing something. But, we have to be open-minded to that. Otherwise, we're just going to become the dinosaurs of people who used to be in tech, of people who used to code. And then we're going to move on to be that Walmart greeter or something.
I'm still waiting for drifting VB6.
Well, I think another angle to this question is also interesting, is the organizational reality. Let's say you build something with a tool and you're a little bit outphased now, and you bring on the new people, the new hungry young Turks that want to prove themselves. And it's interesting that when you're in that kind of tech debt, you're in that awkward position of, okay, we did well for what we knew, and now we need to move forward, and somebody wants to make a name for themselves. Learning how to lead in that environment, learning how to work around these trade-offs and keep the organization moving together well is important. Because I've seen that a lot, where somebody new will come in and say, oh yeah, that's a bad idea, let's just go. And without any real deference to that's expensive, or now that makes sense, but we have other priorities we need to handle first. But they're we just hired them, so we're really excited about them, and we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's a little bit disruptive in an organization. So learning how to lead in an environment where that is existing, and sometimes you just need to go, and the new person can push you in the right direction, and sometimes you really can't. So the human element to that gets complicated too.
Can I put my finger on this point? And I'm going to push on it. It's going to hurt folks. But all these problems we're talking about, we've kind of talked around a lot of the technological and, and systematic ways of thinking about them and handling them. But I have almost never seen this kind of problem exist where there wasn't a major organizational component to it. David's talking about, hey, what about the organizational concerns? There's almost always, at least 30, 40% of the concern. And sometimes it's 60 to 70 to 80% of the concern. It's manifesting as a technological problem. It's an organizational problem.
Yeah.
Developers are tinkerers, right? And if you're in a management position with developers and you hire your new fresh employees, they're all interested in kind of proving themselves, and they may be bringing some pet technologies or something they've wanted to work with for a while into the organization, and it may not necessarily be the best choice. So managing that well is a challenge. How do I allow the developers to satisfy that need to be curious and try new things and kind of be on the cutting edge of stuff, but at the same time making the correct technical choices for my organization and where we need to be, in 2 years, 5 years, whatever.
Yeah. Well, and it's in a lot of ways, by allowing them to tinker, we're nurturing them, and allowing them to grow and to be better people. And so it's tough because there's a technological side, there's the organizational side. What can we develop? How do we lead? One thing that I've tried, I don't know if people that I've worked with would agree with me, but what I've tried to do is I say, well, these are our priorities. This is our biggest risks. If we get this wrong, everything goes wrong. And I'm just very open about that. So people can show me what I'm missing. I'll set the priority and the direction. Like, guys, this is our biggest risk. We have to be faster on our turnaround, or we have to be, whatever the thing is that we have to accomplish. And then if the team really disagrees with either my priorities or how I'm handling them, they can tinker and get involved and push in a way that I don't take it personally. Like, I'll do the best I can, but I'm open about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And then they can come and show me that I'm an idiot. And and fine, I was lacking awareness. I didn't have the thing that I needed. So that helps take the edge off a little bit, but it's a really tough thing. I want to develop the people. I want to develop the technology. I want to protect the company. And sometimes those interests are at odds with each other. And I've had people leave that got impatient, where I just have identified the priority is this, and they just did not want to work on that priority at that time. And that was just the fair thing to do, is they went and found a place to be better suited.
Yeah, if you've stayed long enough with an organization, for me, and this kind of speaks to what Dave had alluded to earlier, where I don't think it's not a foregone conclusion that the folks that are wanting to sit on kind of out of the box rails aren't bleeding edge. I've gone off on these tinkering quests, and we've done SPAs with pretty much every front end stack you can imagine. We've done microservices. We've carved stuff out in different programming languages and things like that. And now my default go-to, because of that experience, is to just stick to Rails.
And to speak to David's point about the developer who doesn't stick around because the company is not entertaining or allowing them to introduce the technologies or stacks that they want to, or coding a certain way, whatever the situation may be, I think that in a lot of cases, those developers are kind of hurting themselves in some ways because they are not going to stick around long enough to see the consequences of those decisions. And then they're going to take them to the next company and introduce them, get bored or get dissatisfied and move on again without ever sticking around long enough to see like, oh, wow, yeah, no, introducing this is a really bad idea. It has some use cases, but I've not come across one yet.
Or the other angle of that is it might have been the right decision a year ago, but it's not now.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. If we can build candor in our thinking and in our conversations, we can usually figure this stuff out, our tools, our processes, where we're going. But having the courage to say, all right, this is how I see it, and this is clearly what's going on. And like, Chuck just said, yeah, that was probably a good idea a year ago, but here's where we are now. And it's always a little bit embarrassing. I guess the candor is hard because personally, I can feel embarrassment when I got it wrong or when good decision, bad result. Sometimes that happens. Given what I knew then, I made a decision, and then what ended up happening wasn't what I was hoping would happen. But that candor, and the willingness to be embarrassed and the willingness to just, all right, this is where we're at, that works, and I've worked around people that they don't have patience for that, or they're so type A and they're so judgmental. It's really a toxic thing. And I've noticed these guys, they end up taking over organizations sometimes, and then all the good talent leaves. They just don't want to be, around that. So making it safe to be candid is also valuable for building a team and a technology stack.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important also just to realize we're talking about this like, oh, well, the best solution is probably to not build an SPA, or the best solution is probably not to do, and sometimes it is. And sometimes we don't have the perfect information to say, oh yeah, we definitely need to go that way. And so, yeah, having those candid conversations about that too, right? We didn't have the information to make the right decision then. So we made the best decision we could. And now looking back, it's obvious that we would have been better off going down that other road. But we are where we are now. So where do we go from here? And then it's not well, I'm judging you, David, because I can't believe you didn't use Vue.js and, Elixir on your project or whatever. It's, okay, well, we built this out in Rails. It works, for 90% of the cases. So what do we do for the other 10%? Because management's telling us that they're critical.
Yeah.
Hey, folks, I want to tell you about a great system that I just found that has made my life a ton easier. That's Cloud 66. A lot of folks think that deploying is a pain. I kind of grew up as an ops guy, and so I never really felt that way until I tried Cloud 66 and realized that the way that I was doing it with Capistrano, pushing stuff up to DigitalOcean, it really was kind of a pain. And when things didn't work, I had to go in and I had to bang my head against the wall to figure it out. Plus, all the setup stuff was just a big headache. And what I found with Cloud 66 is that it's a really nice way just to get everything set up. I just told it I had a Rails app, and off it went. It set it all up. It does the deployment. And now that I have other developers working with me on Podwrench, which is what I'm using it for here, all I have to do is give them access, and then they can go push the button for me, and it gets deployed. It's really nice. It's straightforward. It has all of my environment variables in it, so I didn't have to do any setup that way either. I just had to go in, put in my AWS credentials and a few other things that I was using for third-party apps, and it set it up and ran it. So if you're looking for a great solution for deployments, use the promo code RubyRogues. That's all one word, capital R, Ruby Rogues, for $66 off Cloud 66. This only works for new users, but man, it is awesome. So go check them out, cloud66.com. All right. Well, should we do picks?
Do it.
All right. Nate, you want to start us off with picks?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think I may have picked this before, but I'm going to pick it again because I've just been finding so much value in it. And that is when I've had a need to pair program. You need someone that has an Apple device. So this is if everybody's on Apple stuff, hardware, then you can use Mac Messages to do screen sharing. And it actually works really fantastic. So if you open up your Messages app and go to one of your contacts that's also on some Apple hardware, you can click the drop down by their name and invite them to share your screen, or vice versa. And it's worked very well. Not a whole lot of latency, and you can maintain the call. It's been pretty fantastic. Other pick that's not tech for me would be the Band of Brothers miniseries and the book. Really fantastic. Probably the best war film that's been made, in my opinion. That's
nice.
it.
David, what are your picks?
I've been reading Great at Work by Morten Hansen, and I love it. And it seems to be on topic for what we're talking about today. It's about almost all of the value from really doing well at our jobs comes from focusing and then just obsessing about that decision, performing well, executing well. But he did a great job looking at what works at work across a lot of levels and dealing with the whole manager-employee relationship specifically, how we work with our bosses or our employees or our team. And so it's a great book. I really enjoyed it, and it's clear. So it's Great at Work by Morten Hansen.
Nice. Dave, what are your picks?
All right. So I think the first pick is going to be the Brew Bundle Dump, and I'll post a link to where that is, but just making sure that you're able to quickly replicate your development environment is really important. And the second pick is going to be a show on NBC called Superstore. It's a very silly show. It's really funny, and they have like 4 seasons out now.
I've seen ads for it. Andrew, what are your picks?
Since we were talking about homebrew a lot earlier, I found a cool little tool called Cake Brew. It's a little GUI for seeing all of your formulas and stuff, and you can quickly update your homebrew, update your formulas, find new ones. I think it's cool if you don't want to get too into your terminal. I think if you want to manage homebrew a little bit better.
Awesome. I'm going to jump in with a couple of picks here. Last week I was at Microsoft Build in Seattle. And one thing that I really was really nice when I was traveling is a few years ago I got TSA PreCheck. And that's super nice. You go through the line where you don't have to take off your shoes or your belt. I actually had to take off my belt in Seattle. I think they had their metal detector turned all the way up. Most of the time I can just walk through and it doesn't pick up my belt. But yeah, it's really nice. I don't have to open my backpack or anything like that. And then a few months ago, I went and signed up for Clear, which is, it's basically identity verification when you walk in. So they use your fingertips and retinal scans to verify your information. What's great about it is that if you have both, then what happens is you walk up, you put your fingers on the little finger pad, and it'll verify you that way. If it can't, then it'll use your retinal scans, like I said. But then you just walk up to the front of the line. They escort you to the front of the line. You just show your boarding pass. You don't even have to pull your driver's license out or anything. And you just show the boarding pass to the TSA agent, and you just walk through and get in line for the scanning your bag and stuff. So anyway, the two together has been really nice. So I'm going to pick those. And then I'm also going to just shout out, if you have a podcast that you've been listening to that you wish would come back because it's disappeared, let me know. I've been trying to help some of these shows come back. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to reach out to whatever podcaster you were listening to and see if there's any way we can get that show back up. So, yeah, that's all I got. Well, big thanks to our panel for pinch hitting. Our guest didn't show, but we'll go ahead and wrap this up, and we will be back next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.